What happens when two evenly matched tanks face each other in combat? That's what happened in 1944, when the success of the Normandy landings still hung in the balance.
On the one hand, the American M4 Sherman. On the other, the German Panzer IV. Both of these medium tanks have similar capabilities in terms of firepower, armour protection, mobility, and they are both the most numerous tanks fielded by their respective sides. It wasn't the first time these two tanks had met, and it certainly wouldn't be the last either.
But here, there's a lot more at stake. Here, the winner could determine the outcome of the war. Because in the days after D-Day, Allied armour had struggled to push out of the beachhead, and now German armoured units were positioning themselves to throw the Allies back into the sea.
This would be a disaster, so those early tank engagements after D-Day really mattered.
In this video, we'll compare the strengths and weaknesses of the M4 Sherman with the Panzer IV.
Then we'll look at what happened at Mouen on the 28th of June, who came out on top, and what made the difference.
If you've ever wondered how one tank would perform against another, there are few better places to satisfy your curiosity than in the vast battle maps of World of Tanks. With over 600 vehicles from 11 different nations, World of Tanks allows you to master the tactics of tank warfare. It's free to play, and new players can sign up today and support the Tank Museum using the link and invite code in the description below. And now, back to the video.
By far the most numerous Allied tank in Normandy was the M4 Sherman. It had a crew of 5, boasted good mobility, and mounted a 75mm gun.
Entering service in 1942, the Sherman proved to be reliable, economic, and good to crew. You could build 4 Shermans, or for that matter, 2.5 Panzer IVs, for the price of 1 Tiger I. Now, by this point, 1944, the Sherman's shortcomings have been exposed against the heavier German armour, but that's not going to be a factor in this encounter. The most numerous tank in the German Army's combat inventory by 1944 is this one, the Panzerkampfwagen IV, the Panzer IV. It's got a crew of 5, good mobility, and it mounts a 7.5cm gun. Now, Allied tank crews most fear encountering, the big boys, things like Tiger I, King Tiger, but in fact, this is the enemy tank they are most likely to be facing.
Panzer IV proved itself to be upgradable, ensuring it was still extremely potent and relevant in the conditions of 1944.
Now let's take a closer look at the differences between them. The first thing to think about is armour, and that represents one tank's ability to survive a hit or multiple hits from another.
When you look at the shape of the two tanks, obvious differences hit you. The Panzer IV is quite boxy, whereas the Sherman has sloped armour on the glacis.
The thing to remember here is that the Panzer IV is a pre-war design. The original spec goes back to 1934, and sloped armour, which not only increases the line of sight thickness of the metal itself, but it also increases the likelihood of a ricochet, isn't widely adopted until later. In fact, the Panther is the first German tank really to use it. The earliest model, Panzer IV, the Ausführung A, was pretty thinly armoured. This is actually an Ausführung D, but it's been fairly heavily upgraded, so it's not much different to the Ausführung H, later model, which is the one you'd most often encounter in Normandy. Now, this tank originally had 30mm armour on the turret and on the glacis, but it's been beefed up. There are multiple Vorpanzers on the glacis, there's a pliqué armour on the hull, so actually it's a much tougher nut to crack. It would also have had Scherzen, skirts, or I think in German it's more properly aprons, around the turret and also along the sides. They, I'm afraid, are now missing. The Sherman has often been criticised for poor armour protection, but in fact, it's better than the Panzer IV in quite a few aspects.
The Sherman's frontal armour, totally different to the Panzer IV, is a large single plate, 51mm, that's 2 inches thick, but it sloped back at an angle of 55 degrees, giving a line of sight thickness of 90.8 millimetres.
Add in the applique armour that was fitted to later Shermans or supplied to some vehicles that were already in theatre as what they call blitz kits, and you've got frontal armour of 51 plus 45 millimetres, which is sloped at between 35 and 55 degrees. That gives you a line of sight thickness of 144 mil.
Contrast that with the Panzer IV's maximum armour thickness. The Glacis, in front of the driver, has an original armour thickness of 30 mil, with spaced 30mm and 20mm plates added. With the standoff distance between those plates, that gives you 210mm.
The problems start though when you come around the side and you realise that this plate, the sponson armour, is only 38mm, 1.5 inches thick. Now, there's been a lot of controversy over the years about the supposed vulnerability of Shermans. And a lot of the old nicknames, the Ronson, the Tommy Cooker, stuff like that, they have been debunked. But the fact remains, a lot of crews thought the Sherman caught fire too easily. Lieutenant William Still Brownlee, the 2nd Fife and 4 Fire Yeomanry, and this guy commanded a Sherman throughout the North West Europe campaign, wrote,
"A hit almost inevitably then to brew up. And those who are prone to dismiss veteran accounts should know that 50 RTR in Italy in 1944 recorded, 'It brews up too easily,' near the top of their list of tactical defects of the Sherman, as listed in the regimental war diary."
The problem was inadequate sponson armour with ammunition stored just behind it. Now, these applique patches were an attempt to remedy that, but again, according to Still Brownlee, they just acted as aiming marks. Now, they did realise this, and the problem was fixed when there was a redesign. The ammunition was moved further down the hull and into wet stowage, which stopped it cooking off. But that doesn't happen until later in the war, until late 1944. And the tanks we're talking about in this engagement, our Shermans, didn't have it. So both of these tanks have benefited from some up-armouring, but the Panzer IV in particular has a lot more protection than it would have had as it originally came out of the factory in the 1930s.
From taking hits to giving them out, both the Panzer IV and the Sherman have 75mm guns, which are capable of putting the other out of action.
Not only was the Panzer IV up-armoured during its service life, it was also up-gunned. Now, it starts out as a Begleitspanzer, and that's a support tank for the Panzer III, which is intended to be the main gun tank. As such, it was equipped with a short-barreled KWK 37 75mm gun. And what that's supposed to do is deal with things like anti-tank guns, similar targets that the Panzer III's 37mm gun wouldn't cope with.
As the Panzer III became obsolete, the Panzer IV assumed its role as a gun tank, and it was up-gunned to a long-barreled KWK 40 7.5cm gun. The British in North Africa, when they first encountered the up-gunned Panzer IV, soon realised the potency of this gun and termed the tanks Panzer IV Specials.
The Sherman was built to carry one gun. This one, the M3 75mm. Now, earlier on in the war, this is more than equal to taking on most of the German armour that was on the battlefield, Panzer I to Panzer IV. But later on, it would struggle against the up-armoured Panzer IVs, and that's before you start to think about the heavier German armour. The guns may be the same size, but the performance is quite different. In terms of firing against another tank, penetrating armour, both the Panzer IV and the Sherman use an APC-BC round, which is armour-piercing, capped, ballistic capped. This one is the Panzergranate 39, and this is the Sherman's M61 round. Now, in terms of achieving velocity, and therefore penetration, a lot of this is down to the weight of propellant. And you can see the difference in the actual size of the shell cases. Panzergranate has 2.4 kilograms of propellant. The M61, 0.98. But it's also down to barrel length. This is measured in calibers, so it's basically the width of the inside of the barrel. Now, the KWK-40 gun, Panzer IV gun, is an L60. It's 60 calibers. Now, if you times 7.5 centimetres by 60, that gives you 3.6 metres. The M3 gun on the Sherman is 38 calibers. 38 times 7.5 centimetres is 2.85 metres. So, cutting to the chase, a longer barrel means better obturation. And what that is pressure build-up from the propellant gases, therefore greater muzzle velocity. So the longer barreled KWK-40 has a muzzle velocity of 740 to 790 metres a second, whereas the shorter barreled M3, the Sherman gun, it's only 620 to 625 metres a second. Now, both of these rounds weigh about the same. They're both about 6.8 kilos, but greater muzzle velocity means greater kinetic energy transferred, therefore better penetration.
The Panzergranate 39 will penetrate up to 96 millimetres of 30-degree sloped armour at 500 metres. The M61 will only penetrate 67 millimetres. So, tank on tank, gunnery-wise, Panzer IV has the edge over the Sherman. However, by mid-1944, Sherman's mounting the high-velocity 76mm gun are beginning to appear, and some British Shermans are being fitted with the 17-pounder, creating the Sherman Firefly. But neither of these are involved in the encounter we're going to look at.
So whereas the Panzer IV has got an advantage in hitting power, it's limited in its ability to exploit that by the speed of the turret traverse. Now, both of these tanks have got power traverse, but whereas the Sherman can do a full 360 degrees in 15 seconds, it takes the Panzer IV 23 seconds. In combat, and particularly at the shorter ranges encountered in Normandy, that can make a big difference. The ability for a tank commander to be able to put his tank where it needs to be is essential in ensuring a tactical advantage.
The Panzer IV engine is a Maybach 120 TRL, the same as used in the Panzer III, and the SGR 76 transmission, synchromesh gearbox with 6 forward and 1 reverse gears, is very sophisticated. This makes the vehicle easy to drive, but it comes at the cost of ease of maintenance and repair. This M4A4 has the Chrysler multibank engine, which is surprisingly reliable despite being complicated, and it has a Caterpillar synchromesh gearbox with 5 forward and 1 reverse gear. The downside of this engine is the impact it has on the height of the tank. It's only 30 centimetres taller than the Panzer IV, but it's got an almost top-heavy appearance. This is because the engine itself was tall, so the engine bay had to be tall to accommodate it. It's also because it's rear-engined, but with a gearbox at the front, meaning the drive shaft has to pass under the turret basket, and that gives you the humped effect.
Both tanks have a crew of 5, which is quite normal for the time. So you've got a commander, gunner, loader, driver, and hull machine gunner. But the ergonomics and the actual crew dispositions vary. Where the Panzer IV does score over the Sherman is the commander's position here. This is what we call the throne. He is centre rear of the turret, and he's got an armoured cupola with 7 vision blocks. So that's excellent situational awareness, even when closed down. And of course, if he needs to, he can open the hatches and stick his head out.
Sherman commanders, certainly in the early marks, just had a periscope and a traversing mounting, meaning they were forced to spend a lot more time with their head and shoulders exposed through the hatch. Another difference between the two is that in the Sherman, the radio kit is in the bustle at the back of the turret, and that means the commander, assisted by the loader, has the job of keeping the set on net, which must have been something of a distraction. In Panzer IV, the bow gunner also acts as a radio operator. Now that frees up the commander, but against that, the Funkgerät 5 set is low powered. It's only got a range of about 4 kilometres, and that is less than a third of the number 19 set used in British crewed Shermans. Oh, and being an AM set, the FUG-5 suffered from massive static interference when the tank was moving. The bow gunner also has a dedicated sight for his MG-34, which could put accurate rounds on the target, compared with the bow gunner in the Sherman, who can only aim his 30 cal MG through a basic periscope. This lack of a dedicated sight means the Sherman's MG can only really be used for suppressive fire. Panzer IV, the gunner sits on the left-hand side of the gun, and you can see his manual elevation and traverse wheels, and also the azimuth indicator. And we've also got the excellent Turmzil Fernrohr 5B, 2.5 times magnification telescopic sight. In the Sherman, the gunner and loader's position are reversed. The loader's on the left and the gunner on the right. Initially, the only gun sight was periscopic, but in an early improvement, the gun mount was redesigned to add a telescopic sight. This meant greater accuracy through the 3 times magnification M55 coaxial telescopic sight and a wider field of view through the M4 periscope. The best of both worlds. For the driver, both tanks are easy to drive and light on the controls. Both have similar mobility, a top speed on the road of 35 to 48 km an hour for the Sherman and 38 to 42 km an hour for the Panzer IV, although both speeds are more or less halved off-road. The vertical volute spring suspension of the Sherman gave a notably smoother ride than the leaf spring arrangement of the Panzer IV. If you're doing a lot of miles, particularly across country, that will make a difference to crew comfort and performance. So, by mid-1944, there's not actually a great deal to choose between the Panzer IV and the Sherman. Panzer IV has got the edge in terms of firepower and the commander's situational awareness, but the Sherman has got a faster turret traverse, and the gunner's got an advantage because, of course, he's got a periscopic and a telescopic sight. To understand how these tanks would perform against one another, we can look at a short but violent action, which would be repeated across Normandy when Sherman and Panzer IV went head-to-head. The date is the 28th of June 1944. It's 3 weeks on from D-Day landings. The Allies have yet to secure a breakout from the Normandy beachhead and capture the strategically vital city of Caen. As part of Operation Epsom, 3rd County of London Yeomanry, part of 11th Armoured Division, are attacking enemy positions on the River Odon. The Germans were wrong-footed by Allied deception into thinking that the landings were going to happen in the Pas de Calais, not in Normandy. But what that means is most of the major armed formations weren't able to intervene until the Allies were preparing to break out. On top of this, the Norman countryside, which is known as the bocage, consisting of small fields surrounded by high hedgerows, is far from ideal tank country. Consequently, lines of sight are very limited, and tank actions that occur in the early days are small scale and fought at close range. Instead, the Allies are making the most of air superiority and massive artillery bombardments to inch inland. Despite this, the countryside favours the defenders, so progress is agonisingly slow and costly. Among those on the receiving end of this overwhelming firepower is 21st Panzer Division, who've been in continuous action since the invasion started, sustaining heavy losses. Between the 6th of June and the 8th of July, the division lost 54 Panzer IVs and only received 17 replacements. Many of the Panzer crews were experienced. They'd seen service over on the Eastern Front. But there are others, replacements, who are fresh from the Panzerschulen, the tank training schools. Man for man, they are generally more experienced than the Allied tank crews they faced. They'd also been used to the vast open spaces of the Russian steppe, which favoured massed armoured formations. They'd have to adjust to a very different form of tank warfare in Normandy. On the 28th of June, they are ordered to support Panzergrenadiere of 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte in a counterattack on British positions at Mouen. Due to the losses it's already sustained, it's only able to spare 4th Company of 22nd Panzer Regiment. 4 companies lead Zug of 5 Panzer IVs, avoiding the dense bocage and using the embankments for cover, follows the cutting of a single-track railway towards Colville, passing the wrecks of tanks of the British 23rd Hussars knocked out the previous day. As they near Mouen, 3 Stuart light tanks of 3rd CLY recce troop emerge from a forest track and blunder into their path. Realising their mistake, the Stuarts attempt to reverse, but they're in big trouble, and all 3 are hit by the lead Panzer IV as they reach the railway. With the railway now blocked by burning Stuarts, the Panzer IVs scale the embankment into the hedged field to the side, before supporting the Panzergrenadiere in an assault on an isolated company of British infantry holding Mouen. Having rolled up a position, the Panzergrenadieren dig in, with the Panzer IVs as flank cover north of the railway. The Panzers wait, hull down, for the counter-attack. They don't have to wait long. 3 squadrons, 16 Sherman tanks from the 3rd CLY, supporting a battalion of infantry, are advancing towards them, expecting only light opposition.
At 3-1, the Panzers are heavily outnumbered, and that makes the outcome more or less inevitable.
3 CLY advance with B and C squadrons in the lead, 1 each side of the railway, and each accompanied by a company of infantry. A squadron is in reserve to provide fire support. The attack begins with an artillery barrage, but this hasn't dampened the defenders' resolve. They open up with MG fire, which disorganises the infantry and forces the Shermans to push on in front. Concealed and firing from a hull-down position at a range of about 80 metres, 1 Panzer IV dispatches the 3 lead Shermans. Before its commander, Unteroffizier Eichler, is decapitated by a shell, and the tank, in trying to retreat, is knocked out. This is the high point of the German defence. After that, the weight of fire tells, and one after the other, the Panzer IVs are picked off. 422 is hit on the turret and suffers damage to its Scherzen, which makes it impossible to reverse the turret. Having jettisoned the Scherzen, the tank is then hit again. 413, its crew having successfully repaired a broken track under fire, is hit and destroyed, as is Stabsfeldwebel Neighbourners 434. Feldwebel Korfleurs 425, suffering damage to its engine, catches fire and is abandoned by its crew. 4 Company has now lost a total of 12 Panzer IVs in 2 days, leaving it with only 5 remaining. These are losses it couldn't afford. Meanwhile, the CLY had lost 4 Shermans, but in gaining the ground they are able to recover 3 of those knocked out, rated damaged rather than destroyed, either for repair or salvage for parts.
In this small victory, we can see how Germany will eventually be defeated. In this engagement, we've seen that Sherman and Panzer IV, 1944, are fairly evenly matched. But here's the crucial thing. It's often said that wars are won in factories. And this has demonstrated that. The ability to produce the colossal amount of material to supply armies in the field would be the war-winning factor.
Just under 50,000 Shermans were built, making it the second most prolific tank of the period after the Soviet T-34. Crudely put, this made Sherman losses more affordable.
But the Panzer IV was built in much smaller numbers, just over 8,500. Now, why was that when the actual production run was several years longer than that of the Sherman?
German tanks were the product of highly skilled engineering. Each vehicle, right up to the end of the war, was almost hand-built to exacting standards. And throughout the war, German tank production was dogged by the need to produce more complicated and probably over-sophisticated vehicles, which of course slowed production overall.
Putting it simply, Germany produces some very good tanks, but never in sufficient numbers, and certainly not enough to replace losses on days like this. The Sherman story is the exact opposite. Using the American genius for mass production, and particularly things like the automobile and the railroad industries, tanks were produced in huge numbers in factories that had probably never even built one before. But what counts in the end is the ability to throw a huge volume, men and especially material, at a rapidly depleting Wehrmacht.
For the German Panzerwaffe, the situation would continue to deteriorate.
Once the breakout had been achieved, Allied victory in Western Europe was more or less assured. It wouldn't be easy, but it would come.
So, how do the Sherman and Panzer IV fare in World of Tanks? The Sherman has several offerings in World of Tanks, with variants available from the US, UK, France and even the Soviet Union. One of the most mass-produced tanks in World War II, the M4A1 Sherman is a solid Tier 5 medium tank that delivers good damage per minute, firing rate and a decent top speed. Best to play with the hull hidden due to the vehicle's thin armour. The Panzer IV was the most prolific tank for Germany during World War II. Specifically, the Panzer IV Os H can be equipped with cannons that range from 75 to 105mm. That 105mm gun can deliver some of the highest damage per minute amongst its tier, and its front hull armour is better than that of the same tier Sherman. Just be aware of the average to below average top speed.
Thanks for watching. Do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, subscribe, and if you can, support us on Patreon.